the story, first and foremost for me, is not climate change, it's one of human development. I think we're sitting here because we realize, all of us collectively, that in order to implement these sustainable development goals, which we're doing in 2 weeks' time again in the UNGA week in New York, that climate change is probably the most pertinent issue. Issues like poverty or income inequality and many of the other things coming out of the Sustainable Development Goals are firmly rooted in us being unable to attack the issue of climate change. Now, we have an incredible opportunity here, but it's not easy for business, because if we want to address this, it goes farther than climate change alone. It really goes into changing an economic system. How do you give businesses space to move the financial markets to the longer term to be able to do this? How do we move from a linear consumption or mindless consumption pattern, if you want to a more sustainable consumption pattern? How do we create inclusive growth? And frankly, the bigger challenge that we're talking here now is, how do we decarbonize a global economy when the only way we know how to grow it at scale right now is basically being carbon junkies? Historically, we'd like the governments to play the role. Governor Brown is the exception, but far the exception, because broadly, globally, global governance seems to be absent at a time that we need it most. So I'm sitting here because my life brought me in business. I wasn't meant to be. I wanted to be a doctor. I probably still would like to. I wanted to be a priest, but decided that there are better things in life. But I ended up being in business. And then I discovered the power of the private sector to make these changes. And if we can represent companies like this, it's not by luck, it's because we're meant to be. And how can we drive then collective action to drive these changes? The discussion is about moving forward. In Paris, we succeeded to have the narrative change with the private sector. Very much trade-off. I need to have economic growth, otherwise I don't get re-elected, and I need to tackle climate change, cost me money, I can't do both. The narrative changed fairly effectively to, if you don't tackle climate change, you don't have economic growth. And now we are in desperate need to make a new narrative. Since Paris, we saw a lot of momentum, but it's clearly not enough. Not to bother each other with the statistics, because I think we're talking to the converted here anyway, but it's all about not anymore the direction, not anymore convincing the skeptics. It's all about scaling and implementing with speed. And as we move forward, what we're trying to do here is, first of all, be mindful of what we need to do. Max peaking by 2020, net zero by 2050. Don't deviate from that. Don't let anybody come in with other targets. The best thing you can do with the private sector is clarity of what needs to be achieved. The task is difficult because infrastructure is going to double in the next 15 years. The urban population is going to double in the next 30 years, more or less. So that pressure that comes in what we have to do is probably more than we realize in our current plans. What we are saying is very simply moving forward and sticking with the story is, first and foremost, get these science-based targets. We have now, and Ananda's here, and thanks again for your leadership in this, but there's no doubt that we need to be clear on science-based targets and a price on carbon. What we value, what we measure, we treasure, if you want to. We currently have 22% of the emissions on global emissions as a price on carbon. 500 companies are actively involved. We're getting there. The second thing is disclosure and transparency. You cannot build that trust if we don't build that with the transparency. The task force on financial disclosure, the Bloomberg County task force, is gaining momentum, and we need to get more companies behind it. Currently about 400, representing 6.3 trillion in market cap. And likewise, financial communities representing 81 trillion in market cap are now behind the targets. The third thing that we're pushing is to get the financial markets to move. Unfortunately, and I say that in this global economy, things don't move if the financial market doesn't get involved. We have enough now calling for green bonds or prices on carbon, but it's far more than that. We need to get the financial flow to move in the direction to these more sustainable long-term investments. And finally, when we get to infrastructure, with the tremendous opportunity we have to create a better world, we have this window, probably of the next 2 or 3 years, to design our sustainable infrastructure in a proper way. And again, we need to bring the attention to everybody on what that really looks like. I'm personally very passionate about the food and land use system because it's about 37% of the climate change solutions. It was Hubert Reeves who said, actually, and a Canadian philosopher is, man is the most insane species. He worships an invisible God and destroys a visible nature. not realizing that the visible nature he destroys is the invisible God he worships in the first place. Food and land use is 37% of the climate solutions. It only gets 3% of our attention and funding. None of the Paris agreements, which 122 countries gave out of the 193, that committed to reforestation or restoring degraded land, has done anything about that. So I'm glad that the governor has given it some attention here, and that we can bring that part of the infrastructure, which is a natural solution, by the way, that restores not only our biodiversity in terms of the forest, but also it preserves the species on which we depend equally, and that's first. And then last but not least, what I'm enthusiastic about as a business and a sizable business globally, we need to look at transformative change by aggregating the aggregators. Many people here are working on many great things, but how can we really combine some of these efforts to implement that in scale? And at the end of the day, we need to do that by putting the people in the center. If there's any story coming out of this, and the testimonies that I've heard, is that the aspect of what we now call just transition. How do we ensure that in all these tasks that we achieve, that the ones that we've left behind are really the ones that are benefiting from our actions? And your testimony from Barbados brings that more to life than anything else. I want to thank you for that.